Now that we've had a delicious lunch, we need to make sure that you have a scintillating discussion right after lunch. We already heard today in the last 3 sessions about shifting powers. We talked a lot about trust and trust deficit, both internally but also externally. We also talked about how technology often underpins many of these changes. And I think in the area of resources, especially that of energy, we certainly have seen a lot of new technological development that amount to some kind of revolutions. I'm not only talking about the shale gas revolution, but also that of the clean energy revolution. But perhaps it is the shale gas revolution in the US that has most captured imagination, particularly for the foreign policy lot, not least because there have been so many articles written about whether or not the US will be changing its policy, will be shifting its focus in light of its newfound energy self-sufficiency, if not from itself, but certainly from a North American perspective. Whichever way the US may end up turning and shifting, and we will no doubt talk more about this today, what we do see is that for the first time in 40 years, partly powered by the shale gas revolution, the US seems to have choices in its foreign policy. And perhaps because of that as well, and that it has access to cheap energy at home, having access to energy is also increasingly seen as a key ingredient, again, in economic competitiveness. And as the US is inching towards North American energy self-sufficiency, we're also seeing developments in Russia, in the Ukraine, putting energy security very firmly back on the agenda in Europe. Alongside all of these geopolitical evolution and trends around energy and new energy, we also see the narrative in the world moving gently away from one that we saw a couple of years ago, which is really one of a perception of impending scarcity, to one where we're now assuming that there could be abundance. At the same time, we're also seeing a lot of stepping up of environmental action and policy, not least because the environmental challenge posed by climate change has been increasingly recognized. And I'm pretty sure that the American government decided to announce their policy because of our conference yesterday. And you might have seen yesterday that the Environmental Protection Agency announced a 30% reduction for its greenhouse gas. China today responded in kind through a senior advisor to the government that it will be also capping its emission as of 2016, followed by an announcement last week, actually, on its action on hydrofluorocarbons, which is an important short-lived climate pollutant. So we're now seeing very many different kinds of developments, not necessarily pulling us into the same space and the same trend. And so our panel will have a very rich discussion today looking at and making sense of how these trends will evolve. Now, first, I would like to turn to Dev Sanyal from BP. How do you see all these different trends pulling, in what direction are they pulling, and how do you see these dynamics playing out in the oil and gas market? And perhaps one question that I hear a lot, including in China and others, is, can the shale gas revolution be replicated?
Well, thank you, Bernice. I think it's extraordinary when you take a step back. I joined the industry 25 years ago, and 25 years ago, the narrative was very much around peak oil. It was the fashionable idea of the day. Clearly, the idea of peak oil has peaked. The reality, as Park Davis, one of the great geologists of the last century, as he said, whenever we thought we were running out of oil, we discovered we were running out of ideas. So I think the great challenge that we were faced with 25 years ago around sufficiency is no longer the great challenge. Now, at some point, there is no doubt that the age of oil will come to an end. But I would assert, a bit like the Stone Age did not come to an end because we ran out of stones. Similarly, the age of oil will come to an end because something else will come along. But meanwhile, there's a lot of it around. And the shale revolution, I think, is a testimony to that. The technological revolution that has underpinned the shale revolution is something that is absolutely extraordinary. If you look at the Bakken developments, back in 2007, the production was around 200,000 barrels a day. Today, the Bakken is producing 1 million barrels a day. If you remember, The Economist last year had this sort of rather amusing headline, Saudi America. And this has been a game changer, there's no doubt about it. And it's been a game changer on many different levels. But I think the lesson from the shale revolution is that the conditions below the ground have to be very, very good. But the conditions above the ground have to be compelling for that development to take place. So why is it that the shale revolution and I think revolution is the right way to characterize it, Bernice. Why did it take place in the United States? Well, a combination of factors, a cocktail, if you will, came together in an extraordinarily powerful way around innovation, mineral rights, technology, of capital markets, which is lubricating these developments. And I think the real challenge is, can this revolution now be replicated in other parts of the world? In other words, can the above ground conditions be replicated to liberate, if you will, the below ground conditions in what we know are prospective regions around the world, in Asia and Africa, in Argentina, elsewhere. I think the second sort of big challenge, as one looks back, has been around security, and you've alluded to it in your opening remarks. Again, I think what we have seen is, this idea of energy independence I don't quite like. I actually believe what we have seen in America is a move towards energy self-sufficiency. And that is sort of happening at some pace. But actually what we have seen in the last decade has been energy interdependence. When you look at sort of big exogenous shocks like Fukushima, when a lot of capacity went away, well, the market was able to digest it. And the caricature, of course, is that what happened is gas from Europe moved to Asia, coal from America moved to Europe, and the shale revolution, of course, made sure that the coal was exiled, if you will, from America to Europe. So security and the nature of traded markets is incredibly important. And the final dimension is sustainability. And again, I think prior to the financial crisis, my own perspective is that we were a lot more focused on, if you will, the end point, as opposed to means to the end. And I think there is a great opportunity in terms of the transition to that end point. And gas has an incredibly important role in that respect. To put in perspective, a 1% increase in natural gas in terms of its displacing coal has the same economic and environmental effect as 11% growth in renewables. So renewables is undoubtedly the fastest growing part of the energy complex and will continue to grow. But in the meanwhile, the real debate is, how do we get more gas into the mix? And if you look at America, this is a country which actually is now sitting at GHG levels, which is sort of back to 1995 levels. Extraordinary, as a result of the shale revolution.
Well, thank you. I mean, you painted a very interesting picture with the three big questions about, can shale be replicated, the concept of sufficiency in some ways replacing or sitting alongside security, and also the fact that sustainability is part of the journey. I mean, Paul Stevens, do you see disruptions to these three trends?
That's a lovely question. It's like letting a kid loose in a toy shop. There's a very long list of potential disruptions. You all know Murphy's Law, which says anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Well, Stevens' Law says Murphy was an optimist. So there's a very long list of things I could talk about, but I'll restrict myself to two or three. One of the first major disruptions has already happened. This is the shale technology revolution that we've talked about. One point I would make about it that's worth remembering is this revolution has received a lot of attention in the last 4 to 5 years, but it's over 25 years in the making. It's been around for quite a long time. But the impact has been absolutely incredible. I mean, in 2011, the oil market analyst joke was the next member of OPEC would be North Dakota. And in fact, at the end of 2011, North Dakota was producing more oil than Ecuador or Qatar. And in the 3 years since the start of 2011, US oil production has increased by about 3 million barrels a day. That's an incredible increase in a very short space of time. And of course, the implications of this, as you've already indicated, is it raises issues of energy independence or energy self-sufficiency, and the implications of that for US foreign policy. In my view, an awful lot of nonsense is being talked about this, that the US will no longer police sea lanes, they lose interest in the Middle East. I mean, superpowers police sea lanes, it's what they do. And as for interest in the Middle East, the oil market is one big pool. So if the oil price is $200 a barrel in Ras Tanura, Saudi Arabia, it's $200 a barrel, give or take, in Houston. In other words, the emphasis is switching away from physical supply concerns to actually the macroeconomic impact of very much higher oil prices. The question is, to what extent has this changed attitudes? And this comes me to my second change, and that is that, as you say, we have moved away from a world in which there was a perception of energy scarcity, epitomized by the ideas of peak oil, which were always a very seriously flawed argument. You can't talk about something like that without talking about price and costs, and the geologists fail to actually do that. So now talking about plenty. Now, I think, again, this is perhaps being over-optimistic, because while there is no doubt the resources are there, whether the resources are going to come above ground is another issue, and there are obviously very serious political limitations on this. There's also a question mark about the viability of the US experience continuing. There are a number of voices now being heard that says, well, maybe the shale gas or the shale technology revolution in the US is a bit of a flash in the pan, and given the underlying economics of a lot of these projects and the financial state of a lot of the operators, we could well see a situation in a few years where the sort of the increase in production is not available. We also get into the issue, of course, of unburnable carbon. This is an interesting new one. If you Googled unburnable carbon 12 months ago, you would have got very few hits. You do it now, there's a lot of talk about the idea of unburnable carbon, to say, yeah, we've got all this stuff, but God help us if we burn it, because we're then in very serious trouble. I think the third disruption that I'll mention very briefly is what I see as the prospects for oil prices. And here, I refer to something I've been calling OPEC's dilemma. It's a very simple idea. The Arab uprisings have significantly increased the supply price of oil to the Arab producers. So, for example, in 2005, Saudi Arabia needed $50 a barrel to break even. Now it's more like $100 a barrel. Can they get those prices? Yes, they can, but you can't have a situation where you have oil prices and not have market feedback loops. So the high price will lead to demand destruction, an increase in non-OPEC supply, and you don't need to be a brilliant economist to realize that a market situation where you have a relatively high price, weak demand, and increasing supply is not sustainable. And for me, it's very reminiscent of the period 1980 to 86. Very much the response of the high oil prices of the 70s, and of course in 86 we ended up with an oil price collapse. Of course, if that happens, this will have very serious political consequences in the oil-producing regions, which could well lead to a sort of Arab uprisings Mark 3 or 4, depending where we're up to on that, which of course in turn could spook the markets. And so we're looking at the prospects of very significant price volatility, and of course oil price is a fairly central variable to a lot of other economic activity, not least the price of other energies.
Well, thank you, Professor Stevens. I mean, Dev, if I can come back to you, do you agree with Paul? Well,
in terms of the price of oil, I think I'm reminded of the great saying by Paul Samuelson, if you forecast, forecast often. So I don't quite know what the answer will be in terms of the price of oil, but certainly the conditions today that we have seen, actually over the last 3 years, has been remarkably stable in terms of actually the price of oil. And the last time the price of oil was this stable was when the price was $17. So this has been an extraordinary period of price stability. And why is that? Well, a combination of factors to do with geopolitics, to do with OPEC, and to do with where demand is actually occurring in the world. So I think in some respects, what the price will be is a function of those factors. And those factors will clearly move up or down depending on the circumstances. But for now, what we have seen is a sort of resting place at around $100. We'll see how that sort of moves forward. The global economy is going to be a big factor. In fact, more particularly, what happens in the non-OECD world. 95% of the demand growth, in our estimation, between now and 2035 is occurring in the non-OECD world, driven by India and China. So they really do matter. What happens in terms of some of the issues that we have seen, the above-ground conditions? Venezuela has one of the largest deposits in the world. It's actually a top oil country, but it's not a top producer. And again, the factors that have resulted in that are more to do with the above-ground conditions than the below-ground conditions. So I think there are a whole bunch of factors to do with markets, to do with the above-ground factors and geopolitics that have come together in a way that have supported these prices. We'll see what happens as we move forward. But certainly, as far as producers are concerned, as far as OPEC is concerned, this seems like, for now, a pretty good spot.
Thank you. I mean, let's go to Norbert Rottgen, who chairs the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Bundestag. I mean, Germany is very actively trying to shape its energy demand in a particular direction, and yet you're also at the heart of many of these geopolitical challenges, whether it's about gas in Russia, whether it's about something that happened very far away in Fukushima, ended up feeding back on your domestic policy, and obviously a very strong set of domestic preferences for the kind of energy system, it seems, that you would like to see. I mean, what are your options with these developments around the world?
Yes, you're right. We in a way are at the heart of the European problem when it comes to energy, because we 3 years ago took the decision to fundamentally shift electricity production in Germany by systemically enhancing renewable energies and energy efficiency. And now we are confronted with a European crisis about Ukraine, and this crisis is an asymmetrical crisis, and it is more upon energy and energy security and energy supply than it is that the Europeans respond a military attack towards Ukraine with military tools. We will not do this, so we are facing a different conflict. And for this, one can ask, this decision was undertaken 3 years ago, and how to assess this decision and how are the prospects facing these crises. My first remark would be referred to the question of the shale gas revolution. We are facing abundant energy resources. I think facing this new development, the German decision proves to be right and a perspective for future energy supply. Because this decision, one reason for this decision was the conviction that Germany and Europe will not win the race to the bottom in terms of prices. But we have a chance to win the competition about technology and innovation. And for that, we will say that the efficiency technology, the technologies about renewable energy, the prices have sharply decreased in the meantime, will be relevant because the future will, despite all abundancy of fossil fuels, the future will not be fossil. Because we have and face the most urgent scarcity we talk less and less about, and this is a depository of the atmosphere, or the atmosphere as a depository for CO2 gases. This will be relevant not only in 20 or 30 years, but it is relevant today. We have to undertake a fundamental shift. We do not achieve it, but we will see the consequences if not. And for this future, where there will be 9 billion people living on Earth, we simply cannot afford to simply use the abundance of fossil fuels. So this is a lucky situation for now, but it is not the path towards a sustainable future. So in this future, we will simply need, in order to survive, in order to combine ecologic responsibility with sustainable growth, in order to create and safeguard the living conditions for billions of people, we will have to apply these technologies. And I think the German energy shift, Energiewende, is the decision of an industrialized country to give evidence to what is needed to supply energy with green and climate compatible tools. So I think this is viable, and this decision is viable also when we are confronted with this new abundance of shale gas. The second new development is a new experience with the question and challenge of energy security. As I mentioned, the conflict about Ukraine is an asymmetrical conflict. We are facing that Russia and Putin applies military tools, military intimidation towards Ukraine, but we do not respond militarily. We respond with diplomacy and with non-military means. But we witness and observe that this conflict is different in many ways from the Cold War conflict. Globalization is by definition a creation of mutual dependencies. And by this we are exposed to new vulnerabilities and weaknesses. And beside other challenges, as we talked about cybersecurity, I think energy security belongs to the new vulnerabilities we are facing. And for this, the increase of renewable energy, Germany now has in the first month of this year a share of 27% of electricity production by renewable energy. This means that to this extent we do not need to import energy, but we substitute the import of energy resources with domestic electricity production. And this is job and growth creation on the domestic ground, and it contributes to energy security. But energy security is also a question of solidarity, and for this we have to see that, for example, the Baltic states are to 100% dependent on Russian gas supply. Germany is dependent on 1/3 by Russian gas supply, Bulgaria nearly to 100%. And for this, I think energy security is an urgent challenge for European foreign and security policy. I think we have to perceive energy policy as economic policy, as climate policy, because energy is related to climate, as I tried to outline, and explicitly as a part of security policy. Security cannot only rely, and less than in the past, on military tools, but we have different and new vulnerabilities. And for this, I would supply the tools are diversification of the suppliers. We have to include more LNG. It is to enhance renewable energy, and it is to create a single energy market in order to strengthen the European Union, the demand power of the European Union. And I think we have to debate if energy security could contribute to a new perception of the transatlantic partnership. This is based on the experiences and necessities of the Cold War era. This era is over, and by this we have to refound this partnership where there is no better alternative to this partnership. And I think energy security and the contribution of the US to a transatlantic energy security could be a new pillar of a new transatlantic community, and we should talk within the within the transatlantic community about this new pillar of transatlantic community and partnership.
Well, thank you. I think we can see some themes actually emerging, I think, and all three of you, for different answers to different questions, I think come up with, I think, quite similar general observations that obviously there is a renewed emphasis on security, but that security has to be placed within the context of interdependencies. And in fact, you just added a concept which is the solidarity as well, amongst friends especially. And a lot of the conditions are dependent on situations above ground. And regardless of whether or not resources will run out or not, there are other constraints, such as carbon space, that could potentially be the shortage, rather than necessarily stuff from below the ground. I'm only summarizing this right now because I thought we could turn to Suresh Prabhu, who I'm on good intelligence, was told that you can give us good insight in terms of where the new government may head. Now, for an emerging economy like India, who struggles with all of these questions, import dependency, domestic supply, but also obviously energy access as well as environmental challenges. There's a lot that probably could be done and needs to be done in the new administration. How would you see that play out?
Yeah, thank you. You know, this is one of the very most pressing challenge for India because we have to, first of all, make sure that out of our 1.25 billion people, all of them get access to energy. And if you don't provide them commercial energy, they will normally resort to the fuel that is not necessarily a sustainable way of doing it. You will have a deforestation as a result of it. So first of all, this is a most important issue as far as the humanity is concerned in terms of social development. The second aspect is we cannot really bring about economic transformation unless we have enough energy available to all the people of India. So this is a most important economic issue, which has also consequences on employment. So this is another part. The third part is the most important part, is that the type of energy that we bring into the country, particularly oil and gas, and now coal, is basically imported. Now oil, we have been importing 70%, gas from only LNG, mainly from one country, coal, mainly from 3 countries. And we already imported 173 million tons of coal, and we'll be importing about 200 million tons of coal in the next few years. So it's a huge dependency on imports, which causes all types of consequences. One is, of course, the energy security issue. Other is the strain that it causes on your fiscal situation, and also it causes on your currency, because when you're importing so much, your currency gets depreciated, and when you're importing so much, the depreciated currency also adds to the inflation in India. So this is a very important and pressing issue for the new government. It's just a week old, so the government is just sworn in last Monday, but one of the most important priority. So to deal with that, I think we need, of course, a domestic action. So we are already working on large areas of making access possible through distributed generation. In fact, I remember as a minister, I had passed a new law which has now allowed the private sector to come in a big way, as Electricity Act 2003. And also now we are trying to get in large communities to actually generate their own electricity, and then they can distribute it themselves. So this is something which we are trying to work on. Just picking on some of the points that were said earlier on global action that is really necessary. If you really look at it, on one side we are giving huge subsidies for fossil fuel type of fuel that we use, oil, gas, even coal to some extent. And that's something like maybe $70 billion. And then $600 billion. And where do you get that money? The money is actually paid by the people who consume it. It's not something which is actually paid by somebody else. So the consumer is paying for a subsidy as to the producer of oil and gas in different countries. So rather than that, could we think about a system whereby we actually put a lot of money into invention, particularly the renewables, and we can see that if you actually take solar energy, the solar energy is something which can be produced only in those countries where there is a solar radiation. You cannot produce solar energy if there is no solar radiation. So the country like India, which has got 300 days of sunshine, and there are at least 40 countries in the world who have got a similar profile, that they get 300 days of sunshine almost in all time. So this is something which can be harnessed, and if you can generate solar energy on a massive scale, this could actually bring down the cost of solar energy, because there will be scaling up that will take place. If all these countries commit to make solar energy at the same time, this can bring down the cost considerably. New technology will come in, and whatever we are thinking about giving these subsidies, could we not actually earmark some amount of money for actually global research on this? And why global research? Because we have already been talking about climate change, and in climate change we are already talking about global action. We are talking about countries who must reduce their emission, and therefore they must now pay for their past historical commitments, therefore they must put some money on the table, which has not happened. But now, rather than bringing that money for adaptation or mitigation, could we not think about creating a fund to make sure that these new technologies are developed, which can be deployed in the developing countries, particularly like India, which can have a huge benefit, not just for India, but for the global community. Because the global emissions will go down, which will actually help the climate issue that we keep talking about all the time, which will actually help access issue. Because if you recall, about 14 years ago, in United Nations, we had these Millennium Development Goals. What was a part of the goal was to reduce poverty by half by next year. Now I think we have, in United Nations, we are very good in putting goals, but we never achieve them. So I think if we can actually make sure that if we can give access, energy access to people, that's the best way to address poverty. So some of these global issues that we keep talking about, of climate change, of poverty, of energy access, all of this can be addressed if we can put money into renewables in a big way. And I think that will actually help us. In fact, the Prime Minister of India, he has this vision of creating a club of countries who have got 300 days of sunshine. And if they can commit themselves to make it, it could be a huge win-win for everybody to come. So this is a great opportunity for India and also for the global community. So I think we should really seize it. I remember Germany is one country which actually started this process. They started the process of ensuring that there must be a minimum in the grid, minimum of renewable energy must go in. Feed-in tariff was started by them. Of course, they had to phase it out later on. But point I'm saying is we really need to think out of box. Do not necessarily think that now we have to put more and more money into oil and gas and more into coal and make sure. We need that, no doubt about it. I'm not even saying that we don't want oil and gas and coal. We need that. But in addition to that, we really need to focus on renewables in a big way. And if we can do that, actually that will be helping the cause of developing countries a big way, and particularly a country like India, which is going to import otherwise a huge quantity of oil and gas. Of course, my friend will be very happy that we'll be importing it. But I'm sure we should try to find out a way that we import from them, but also we actually invest into new technologies and renewables.
Well, thank you. I think sort of picking up the theme as well earlier on about the above-ground conditions and what Norbert also just said about how, in a way, one should pick the race you know you can win. I'm just wondering, can I come back quickly to Dev, because you've done a lot of business in India, and in India, especially on energy sector, there's often this kind of rather theological debate between markets versus government and what role, and obviously it looks like the dynamics is that in the renewable sector, it's very much led by the private sector, whereas in others are less so. I mean, how do you see that dynamic evolving in the new administration?
Well, I think, just in context, BP is the largest investor in India, and we are certainly the largest investor in the energy sector in India, in offshore India, in Bay of Bengal. India has made some extraordinary strides in many different dimensions over the last few decades. I'll remind you that in 1990, India produced around 284 terawatt hours of electricity. Britain, by the way, at that point in time, produced 320 terawatt hours of electricity. Today, India produces 1,006 terawatt hours of electricity. Britain produces 380 terawatt hours of electricity. So there have been some extraordinary developments, and one should not actually forget those developments, but the journey is not yet complete, and there is more work to be done. I actually agree with you, Suresh. India should not be importing energy. In fact, if you look at the BRIC countries, by 2035, India is forecast to import over 70% of its energy. By far, India is at the bottom of the heap vis-a-vis the BRIC countries. As we move forward, this import dependency is a problem. If you look at India's deficit, if you look at the issues around the current account, energy is a very big contributor. So what can change this narrative? Well, actually, it goes back to my earlier thesis, the above-ground conditions. When the price of gas is at $4.20 and the international market is running at between $12 to $14, well, the reality is that you will not see new investments in the way you could to liberate, if you will, that domestic production from the ground into the markets. And so I think the big challenge in India today is not one of, does India have enough gas? Does India have enough resources in the area of energy? The issue is, can you set the right conditions, the right incentives for investments to occur? That does not mean that you actually will have gas imports at the expense of renewables. It's an all-of-the-above strategy. You need all of it. But the growth of gas will actually mean that the import dependency will reduce dramatically, saving billions of dollars for the exchequer, and will also have a major impact on the environment because, of course, those gas molecules will be replacing the coal that is being burned and some of the unsustainable activities that have been taking place with forest, wood, etc. So I think the challenge in India is actually similar to other countries in the world, which is how do you set the right framework that encourages investments in the way that we have seen in renewables, as you point out, where there has been a framework which has resulted in private sector investments really creating a tremendously important dynamic around solar energy in India.
Well, thank you. I think both Norbert and Suresh want to come back in perhaps quickly before we start bringing other voices from the floor.
Yes, I would like to address this, the power of the markets. I very much advocate the market, but at last you mentioned that there is one deficit of the market. The market regularly cannot foresee the future. So he cannot react to the scarcity of the future, and for this it comes to policy to anticipate the scarcity of the future in order to set up a framework which gives incentives to develop new technologies which have the answer for the scarcities of the future and which would not emerge under market conditions because they are not competitive. So there are two opposite challenges. Those who rely on fossil fuels and of the abundant gas, the challenge is further to invest, although you have in the present low price gas resources, to further invest in the new technologies, because if you do not do this, you will have a problem in the future. And those who invest in renewable energies and efficiency, as Germany does, the challenge is to remain in the meantime, when these technologies are not competitive, to remain economically competitive. These are the two challenges we have to address, and the market works as instrument for example, the European trade system has to be refunctioned, but you have to have a framework, otherwise it will not work, and in any case the market will not supply the efficient security when it comes to energy security.
Suresh?
Yeah, just one point that 48% of sedimentation in India is still not explored. So, while we keep importing, we are not yet explored our full potential. And the remaining 52% which is explored is not producing adequately. So that's the point, I agree with you. But the second point is, in fact, if you look at it, gas will be needed for a while because, we need also something for a base load and also something for a peaking. So maybe something has to take care of peak, something will take care of base load and peak. But renewables, if you do not try to focus on it now, the benefit of that is not going to come tomorrow. If you do not invest into renewables as a global community today, we'll not get benefits of it of 10 years down the line. So if you are investing in future, then we must start investing into renewables in a big way now. And for that, we really need to create an ecosystem of the global players, because renewable is not something which is going to happen in the laboratory. There are already a lot of technology which has been developed, which has to be integrated to make sure that our efficiency of solar panel increases. Solar thermal, the concentrated solar power, we can actually make it more without using water maybe. So these ideas will be generated from different sectors. So to creating a global ecosystem of scientists and people and companies like Shell and the BP, I think that's something which will be extremely interesting. So what we really need to bring together is a different type of companies and people together and the global community support. So that is what I was just saying, that while we do this, we should do that as well.
Well, thank you. I think, again, on the same theme in many ways, on the above ground, really, experience. And I would like to bring in Stuart Brooks from Chevron. I mean, we've been talking a lot about these interlocking trends. How does it look like from the project perspective or on the ground for you, where you have a lot of operations as well in different parts of the world?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Bernice. I mean, bringing these macro issues down onto the ground and how we do it in country. And then how does it feed back again? And I think the first thing is that the international extractive companies have to obtain and sustain their social license to operate. So the first step is a whole range of feasibility studies, very necessary, very time-consuming, be it society or the environment or whatever. Some local companies, I have to say, stand by in amazement, as this can go on for sort of 2-3 years before you dig the mine or sink the well, but it is necessary. And then how do you sustain that social license, having got it? And the first thing is local employment, a key factor. And again, we've seen the problems that, say, some of the Chinese companies are having in Africa when they bring their own people in, and the tensions that creates. And at the last count, when I checked, I think 92% of our employees work in their home country. This is a significant advance in recent years, and that goes pretty well across the extractive industries. The other one is corporate responsibility taken to new imaginative levels, rather than the earlier sort of piecemeal unjoined up development, then increasingly we are looking at partnerships here, doing this with development agencies, doing it with in-country NGOs to ensure that long-term sustainability. And it's a perfect marriage because the NGOs bring the expertise that we don't have, and we bring the management skills and the cash that they don't have. And then the third element of this local asset is in goods and services procurement. And without bombarding with statistics, I mean, over the last 5 years, we've put, I think, $250 billion into goods and services. Now, when you scale that up across the whole international extractives company, that is one huge amount of money that's going primarily into developing economies. And then we look at the multilateral ways of dealing with this, and particularly focusing on revenue transparency. And it was 10 years ago, almost to the day in this room, that we kicked off the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And this has a very simple remit at its core, which is the public reconciliation of the payments made by industry and the revenues received by governments. And if those balance, then at least you know all that is in the state budget. Little did we think 10 years ago that now we've got 44 implementing countries, and share this is an entirely voluntary initiative, but mandatory when you've signed up to it. But we now face a challenge of success, because can we have one set of criteria that will match, on the one hand, Niger and the United States of America, the Central African Republic and the United Kingdom, all four of which are implementing EITI countries. So that's a new set of challenges. We then got in parallel the mandatory regulatory revenue transparency systems. So we're at the moment transposing from the EU, from Brussels, the EU Transparency Directive into national legislations, and that's paralleled in the United States by one of the clauses of the portmanteau Dodd-Frank bill. I guess it will be about 2 years before these two have settled down to see what the complementarity is between a voluntary system and a mandatory one, and whether you can run the two. Those are challenges for companies. Challenges for the countries. First of all, how do they try and mitigate, or in the case of new frontier countries, East Africa, Eastern Mediterranean, avoid that massive issues loosely called the resource curse? Well, the obvious simplistic solution is set up a sovereign wealth fund, but not many countries have got the capacity that Norway has to manage that in that way. They are subject, and rightly subject, to an increasing amount of external pressure to go for transparency along the whole value chain. So starting with who owns the licenses, are the shady shell companies involved in this, right through revenue transparency to the other end of utilization of revenues and what the money is spent on. Just wrapping this up, there are many challenges from this. I mean, by and large, all this is moving in the right direction, that it improves, greater accountability improves the business climate, and an improved business climate means that we can better the lives of the people in those communities where we do business. But I would just pinpoint two difficult issues here. One is that, and going back to the session before lunch, we are now producing, and will do more, a vast amount of data. How do we harness this? How do we, for example, stop very simple comparisons being made in the interest of what's known as tax fairness? So the idea that all extractors companies should pay a flat rate of tax wherever they are, utterly regardless of the geology or of the other risks associated with that. So how do we make that data useful for the purposes that it's meant to be of greater accountability without simply just drowning in it? And I think from the country point of view, a difficulty one is applying this external pressure, but not being so intrusive that you get into issues of national sovereignty. And I think that's particularly difficult when you get into revenue utilization. And I know some of our societies would react pretty adversely if told how you should spend the money you're getting from the North Sea or from shale gas or whatever in the States. So we've got to be very careful. And I say we, I mean that's society generally. This is primarily an onus on non-government organizations to do this.
Well, thank you, Suresh. So you've outlined in some ways part of the renewed social license to operate, largely due to a public-private partnership that has obviously now being spread and improving transparency in many places. And as a result of that, also, as you said, the different parts of the license to operate. And if I may now turn to Camilla Tullman, who will, in fact, the question I have for you, Camilla, Camilla is with the International Institute for Environment and Development. Obviously, there is another part of the license to operate these days, which relates to the global environment. We just heard about all these announcements in the last couple of days, and in fact, Suresh, I'm going to come back later and ask you, when will India announce its own, or will India announce something? So, Camilla, how big a momentum are we really seeing in terms of climate action with these announcements last week?
Well, clearly, Obama knew that we were going to have this panel this afternoon. So we got what in itself is not a path-breaking announcement, but one that really pushes us in the right direction. In and of itself, quite clearly, it's not enough. But we have now a US president making much more ambitious pledges on cuts in greenhouse gases than we've had for a long time. And that's shown a willingness to push back on fossil fuel interests in the US and their political representatives. That, combined with what China announced also, gives us real cause for optimism, I think, that we're starting to see a race to the top in this G2 dialogue that we've got going on between China and the US. And I very much hope that that's going to be leading a whole process of more ambitious bids coming in from a number of other governments. I'd like to see Europe start to feel worried by the ambition of those two parties. Well, we can always hope. I think ultimately what we have to put in place, though, is a giant public-private partnership in order to get us to a carbon-neutral world in the middle of this century. That's bound to be a public-private partnership because public policy has to set very clear, loud, legal, long-term targets for where we need to be. At the moment, we don't have that clarity on the public policy stage. And I was glad to hear Norbert talk about, one of the big areas of market failure, which is that it doesn't really think about the future much. Somehow we've got to get the future properly factored into decision-making today. We're not very good at that. We need to be much better at that. And related to that is what on earth we're going to do about the fact that 2/3 of our fossil fuel reserves, and this is before we even start fracking all over the place, 2/3 of our fossil fuel reserves cannot be burned unabated. At the moment, we can't see the value of that reduced carbon reserves reflected in the market cap of the companies involved. And it's going to be quite hard work, I think, to push back at the interests of those companies to force a revaluation of assets, of incomes, of salaries, of bonus payments that will involve. So there's plenty of politics up ahead, which is going to be quite tough, but we've got to somehow encourage our leaders to take that on.
Well, thank you, Camilla. I wonder whether or not now is also time to ask another oil and gas company to share their views on how would you navigate this race at the top that Camilla set out. I'm looking for Simon Henry. There he is from Shell. How would you navigate in this race at the top on environmental considerations and competitiveness?
Thank you, Bernice, and thank you, previous speakers. I tend to agree with almost everything that's been said, but I will raise a bit of controversy later. Just so I'd like to start with a couple of comments made by Dev, with which I certainly do agree. Energy demand will go up, primary energy demand, and the only policy that meets all of the three challenges is all of the above in a responsible way. So the sufficiency, sustainability and security challenge, fully subscribe to. What I'd like to talk about is the role that one particular fuel plays in this, and recognizing gas as today 23% of the world's primary energy demand. Wind and solar today, I think, has just clocked through 1%. Piece of news from yesterday that has not been raised, the IEA released their view on investment levels required in the energy industry to meet that energy demand. $2 trillion per year, every year, for at least the next 20 years, probably till the middle of the decade. That's 2.5% of world GDP. Investment, new investment in energy. So the scale of what is required, we need to remember. And gas, in major projects, comes at the moment probably with a $10 billion price ticket upwards, with a possible exception of the shale, wherever it may be, and typically lasts for 20, 30, 40 years as an investment. So you're talking big numbers and very long periods of time. And all of the headlines that you hear about change foreign policy, etc., have to be seen in that context. Nothing changes overnight in this particular industry. We believe that gas is the only fuel that can meet all three of those criteria. Most fuels can meet two or maybe only one of those criteria. The issue that you see at the moment is pricing. Been referred to as $4.50 per unit. In North America, it's about 10. In Europe, it's 15, 16. In Asia Pacific. There are developments that are taking us towards a more global, liquid market that will begin to equalize some of those prices. But remember, all three, on a calorific basis, are considerably lower than oil and are considerably lower carbon than coal. That was a point made by several people. LNG is the glue that's beginning to open up those global markets, and it is part of the solution, but today it's only 15% of the gas market or so. That's not enough to equalize the prices, but as it grows and as cross-border pipeline deals grow, that will help. It will also help develop gas as the alternative to coal. So this week's, or was it last week's, Russia-China gas deal is a big positive step forward for global energy security, global pricing, and the environment. Not always pictured that way, but that is the effective fact of the matter. And subsequent pipeline opportunities, for example, Middle East, Iran, into Pakistan and India, could be another way of creating that global market in the right way. And we do see that happening. Maybe a word on just North American exports. A lot of views that this will save Europe, only in Europe. Don't hear that said in North America. It'll go where the market wants it to go, and at the moment that's Asia. So unless Europe is playing market prices, that gas will not come here. So that's something that Europe does need to think about in government terms. The market will not solve that one, as also a point made earlier. Do think over time, have to remember carbon capture and sequestration. I can't let the unburnable carbon go without comment. CCS will deal with carbon from gas, 80–90% reduction on coal rather than just the 50%. Biofuels, there are other ways of doing it within the same infrastructure that is embedded within companies at the moment. And I have to close, and I'm sorry, with the energy vendor. Governments and markets really do have to work together, because the fact that they are not aligned at the moment means Germany is pumping out a lot more carbon than it was a few years ago, because what happens with cheap gas in Europe, the coal gets displaced and Germany burns it, and the UK for that matter. So governments, markets, companies must be aligned. And that's why we think yesterday's announcement from the US was good, because essentially it's a market-based solution, but with longer-term government thinking that could provide a blueprint for many others. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Simon. And I'm kind of beginning to think that we do have a couple of conversations going at the same time. And I wonder whether or not, Kyle Koch-Vesser, you with many hats, being not only the vice chairman for Deutsche Bank, but also on the board of BG and also the chair of the European Climate Foundation. So maybe in you, we find the confluence of all these different themes. Would you like to share your thoughts?
I think we all agree on the urgency of climate action, but frankly, how we get from A to B is much less clear. And the UN, of course, will be facing extremely difficult, if not impossible, task to get a sufficiently ambitious result next year in Paris. I think we need, as excellent papers for this meeting suggest, new coalitions. I find the Oxford Martin proposals of 20 countries, 30 world businesses, and 40 city mayors close to the action, one of these innovative ideas. But we need particularly also more like-minded alliances of the big business players. Some good examples already in decarbonizing supply chain, the consumer good industry. We are working on a methane alliance and things like that. But let me illustrate more specifically with 2 proposals for action, picking the toughest ones, which I believe is competitiveness and decarbonization. And second, how to massively scale up investment in sustainable green economy, massively scale up. On the first, let me just say what we are doing at the European Climate Foundation, being challenged by the 2030 package in Europe. Is this compatible at present energy and future energy prices with competitiveness of European industry? We picked, with the best expertise from the private sector we could get in collaboration, the toughest sector, chemical industry, feedstock and energy source. And we did much more than past models had done in terms of macro models or factor cost arguments, an approach where we dug very deep in terms of systems, the whole value chain, the intersectoral, the upcoming circularity of production, and so on and so on. And interestingly enough, the result was that except for some bulk commodities, yes, it is possible to combine competitiveness and this 2030 package. In fact, if done intelligently, it could be a boost, like there have been boosts in the past, to a new level of innovation and competitiveness of the European chemical industry. Not for all chemical products. We went very granular, product by product. Some will have moved anyway, some bulk commodities and others. And I would suggest this is the kind of approach which is now leading to the chemical industry, listening, working with us as a model on the how you can move that forward, and obviously then policy and regulators come in. But in a sense, we start with the business and then go to the regulators rather than the other way around where we have to wait. I believe business community boardrooms are often ahead of cabinet rooms now, but they're sitting on the fence. They have a plan B in the drawer, but before there's not more policy certainty, they don't come down from the fence and join the battle. Very quickly, the second one, I believe we work in the banking industry on that, with many also in this room. There is what I see enormous chance of ESG reporting. What do we mean by that? How do you get long-term institutional, insurance company, pension fund investors, the long-term assets, to differentiate between companies that have, in a sense, a sustainability strategy? Here, of course, stranded assets, all that comes in, as opposed to others. And we see many companies going ahead now, but we need, again, alliances to make that more universal, that report the way they report financially, also on environmental, social, and governance sustainability. Integrated reporting, as it's called. Why not stock exchanges then following suit, as some actually want to do, and require that for listing? And then you begin to move the needle of trillions of investment, ideally long-term, obviously a long process, in making that distinction between what's sustainable and not. So I think on these difficult points of competitiveness and scaling up investment, the private sector can do a lot, and some of this is actually underway in Europe and beyond.
Well, thank you very much, Kaio, and thanks for also edging us as well towards not only what the issues are, but what can one do about them. I would like to take some thoughts from the floor at the moment and some more questions, especially those that Kaio just raised about the appetite of the investors and distinguishing between different kinds of investments. I've got 1, 2, and 3. Can we take them all together? And then if you actually have a question you want a panelist or someone in the room to answer, let us know. And please introduce yourself as well.
Robert Woodthorpe-Brown, a Liberal International, and also Council Member of Chatham House. Firstly, the question of connectivity, I think this is terribly important. We had a meeting in Chatham House about 2 months ago, and the chair of the IEA said at the time that we had full connectivity within Europe of all types of energy, then we would probably be able to have 25 to 30% reduction in price. That was about the only thing that he felt would actually hit the price level. The other thing, we also have been leaving out nuclear, and I know what Germany's done about that. However, this question of this country is now bringing in more nuclear, which I personally regret, because I think they're bringing in old technologies which are not necessary. We ought to be looking at something like the molten salt reactors, which is a technology already developed in the 50s and 60s in the United States, and that does not have the plutonium production, which is why the military didn't want it to continue. And it could be an answer for the Iranian problem as well. If that was the technology they were taking on, then we would not have the proliferation worries.
Thank you. The gentleman next to you, please. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Ludogelo from Tanzania, Economic and Social Research Foundation. I would like one of you at least to comment on how do you see the role of multinational or international community in helping Africa. Remember, we have 1 billion people. 98% of them still use biofuel, cutting wood for daily subsistence. And we see, of course, the investment now going into natural gas and oil, especially natural gas. But we know the technology on renewable energy, like solar energy, wind energy, is still very expensive, at least the investment cost. And we know Germany has that type of technology. China has the technology for wind energy. And Germany, I think, I went to China once. The Chinese have even modified technology for recycling city waste garbage for electricity generation. If you could say something about how do you see the international community helping Africa come out of their woods, I would say. Thank you.
So we've got basically questions about technologies in different ways, the really high tech, and then how do you get it to others? I think Andrew wanted to come in there.
No need. I was wondering why no one was talking about nuclear, but my learned friend has already asked that question.
Excellent. So let's take a question from just behind. I think the lady behind, Carrie Brown.
Thanks a lot. Hanna Shellis, National Institute for Strategic Studies, Ukraine. All of you were talking more about where to buy or how to get it from different sources, diversification, but not that much talking about consuming. And it is a problem not only about renewable energy, but about modernization. Because some of you were talking about Ukraine and dependence in the energy sphere, and you need to get the root source analysis. I mean, like, why we are so dependent. And the question is that for most of the daily life, we have our own gas and it's enough. The problem is that we have mining and heavy metallurgy that for 30 years are not modernized. So it's consumed at least 3 times more than a lot of well-modernized, developed industries in other countries can. So those businessmen who modernize their plants, they don't care now that much about the problem and dependence from Russia, for example. But those who didn't want, because it was more profitable for them not to invest in modernization and just to have gas on the quite a small prices, as they think, it was profitable personally for their business, but not for the country or for the future development. So sometimes it is the question, are you ready to do something also with yourself, not only to control those who can sell this energy to you?
Well, thank you. I think let's take one more, the lady behind, and then we will see if the panelists would like to choose some parts of it to respond.
From Italy. I have a question for Mr. Rottgen. I agree in theory, but I have to say that I found your presentation of the need for a common European energy policy a bit too complacent, to put it this way. First of all, you said that we have a competitive advantage as far as renewables are concerned. It can be. For the moment being, we have a competitive disadvantage as far as the relationship to the US is concerned. So the problem is that we are favoring, in a sense, reshoring to the US of our energy-intensive industry. And from this point of view, I think that we have a real problem in trying to get the energy chapter in TTIP. So I would like to ask you whether you think that in TTIP it will be possible to have a serious dialogue on energy with the US. The second point, and very briefly, you actually said that we need to have a single energy market, and this is already a big problem in Europe because, as we all know, there is no compatibility between infrastructures, so we would need big investments to make grids, in a sense, compatible. Not only, we need to have a common policy vis-à-vis the big suppliers, precisely because, as you alluded to, energy policy has always been, but it's becoming again a big part of European security policy. On both fronts, I find it very difficult. So since Italy will have the presidency of the European Union, since we hope to get a progress, a step forward in energy, can you be a bit more specific? Which are the real progresses we can make, given that the starting point is so difficult, in fact?
Well, Norbert, would you like to kick us off?
Okay. I would start with the question of how to help and the possibility of the international community to help Africa. I think we talk about the climate change challenge, and we face, at least since Copenhagen, the failure of the international community. Broad-scale failure. There's some progress, but this is definitely inadequate to which is necessary. So, what is the consequence of this? I think as long as we have two preferences, the preference of national interest towards global goods and the preference of short-sighted interest pursue towards long-term policy. And as long as we have more distrust than trust and a lack of international governance, we will not see, as Kajo Koch-Weser mentioned, we will not see an international climate regime which is legally binding. So this is one argument, and for me it is the strongest argument that there are only few policy options left under these circumstances, and one and the most important policy option for Europeans is to develop a European energy policy, which makes us, in terms of market and in terms of policy, stronger as Europeans. And I would say we should not be self-centered in this policy approach, but as a part of our foreign policy, we should seek alliances between the European, which should strive to emerge as a model of a modern energy supply in the field of economy, ecology, climate, and security. And we should seek alliances, especially with those who are mostly hurt and urgently hurt by climate change, and towards African countries, in order to cooperate and to deploy European technology in African countries. I think there is a possibility of forging alliances between European countries, and those who have a necessity to deploy modern technology of energy supply. But I think we have to face that there will be a lack of international governance in the field of energy, and so we should emerge a European energy policy. The question of Ukraine, I absolutely agree. It is about, under the foreign policy aspect and under the energy aspect, it is about to stabilize and modernize Ukraine. This is the field where this battle and confrontation will be decided. I think we observe that Putin tries, by destabilizing the Ukraine, to establish Russian and to re-establish Russian influence. And the European and the Western answer to this should be to stabilize politically, economically, financially, to modernize Ukraine in order to create the economic and political framework to safeguard the self-determination of Ukraine and to create the possibility that Ukraine becomes a success. It is about Ukraine becoming a success or Ukraine becoming a failure, which decides about the European landscape and which decides about if the violation of international law or the perseverance and prevalence of international law will be relevant. Now, when it comes to the European energy policy, first of all, I would argue for and would be in favor for energy as a part of TTIP. I do not see what will be the regulation there, but I'm very much in favor, because I would argue for TTIP in general. And as I mentioned, I would argue for a closer economic and political relationship between and in the transatlantic community about energy. I realize that the American side argues the gas will flow where the market price is the highest. This is I would say, the American position in this field. But I would argue, let's think about the prospect of transatlantic community in a world of disorder. We are talking about order for a globalized world. And to shape the globalized world, to coin this order with Western values is a common, and I would say the most important challenge. And if we think that we will have a chance to coin this international order only by orientation to market prices, it will not be an international order which will be shaped by American, European, Western values. So I would urge to rethink if we should add to the traditional ties between Europe and the US a new field, and energy should be a new field of our cooperation. I argue also in the field of security policy. And if European energy policy claims to be relevant, it is as it is in other global fields. We will not be relevant, be it on the market or in the political field, as member states' policies, but we will only be relevant as a European approach, a European entity, and a European policy. We will have a stronger market if we would have a single market. We observed the potential of the markets in other fields, and it can work in the field of energy, no doubt about this. And it will contribute to our political strength when it comes, for example, to the solidarity as Europeans against our suppliers. As a common market, we will have a stronger demand power as we will have being divided. It is not that much a German problem, but it is a challenge and an obligation that Germany, as the largest economy, contributes to the independence, to the strength, the market and political strength of smaller countries, for example, the Baltic states. And for this, I think it is a great potential in terms of market, and it is a challenge in terms of foreign policy that we unite the European fragmented situation to a unified, single, common market of energy policy and energy supply and production.
Thank you. I mean, maybe I have been a bit indulgent with everybody. Now we are coming to a point where we have about 2 minutes and 37 seconds. So if anyone has a very sharp, piercing 30-second question, 30 seconds, I will take one. Promise? Okay, quick.
Just to support Norbert, when I was in Washington last week, Dr. Secretary Moniz, they're watching very much as a litmus test almost, whether we, with the added dimension of energy security now, get to one single energy policy in Europe. And not to be more than 40 seconds, I think Poland, for Poland particularly, there might be a deal. They have the worst coal users, they're blocking package 2030, but without elaborating, I could see a deal here that moves us forward. It's a new dynamic.
Thank you, Kyle Kochwasser. So if I may ask the panelists, I mean, beforehand we wanted the panelists to listen to all the discussions and then come up with the one thing they would do tomorrow in order to help deal with some of the challenges that we outlined today. 1 minute, 37 seconds, and Robin is watching me, so, and he can see the clock. Suresh, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, one of the points that was mentioned about Africa, it's a great opportunity because actually Africa has all the options open. So they could go in really for a very sustainable energy future. And like what we were discussing, probably creating an alliance of these private companies who could be really interested to focus on these areas. So I think this is a win-win situation. I think this is something 1 billion people in Africa, 1.2 billion in India. So I think I'm just talking about already more than 2 billion people, more than 1/3 of the world. Actually, if you really look at it, this is something which really needs to be done. I'm just taking very little time than him, sorry. So I'm just saying we really need to work in a way that we can actually create a sustainable future which is possible with the participation of companies like this.
Norbert, you have 20
As
seconds.
I said, to forge European common European energy policy, as we should do in any case, in every case where we are facing global challenges. We only can act effectively as Europeans.
Thank you. Paul?
If you look at the history of energy consumption over the last 400 years, there's been a long list of periods when you've had crises of shortage of one sort or another, whether you're talking about wood crises in the US in the mid-19th century, shortages of whale oil, etc., etc. In virtually, in fact, all cases, the solution has come through technology. And technology has come along and rescued the situation. So if there was one thing that I would strongly recommend is that there needs to be a lot of investment in research and development, and there is important distinction between the sort of research and investment that private companies will do and the sort of fundamental science that governments need to fund. And a good example of this is the shale revolution. The shale revolution was built upon the fact that the US government spent millions and millions of dollars into research and development, into low permeability operations. This is the sort of research that private companies wouldn't do. One last thing, I'll cheat and have two. Have a longitude prize for whoever can crack the CCS problem.
Yeah, but we can promise the Nobel, I think. Dev?
Thank you, Bernice. Here's what I would say. Markets have their limits. So does public policy. And we need to be, I think, realistic as we move forward. There are lessons from the last decade that have to be incorporated as we look at the future. When I look at Edigivende and the European narrative over the last decade, I mean, let's be clear. What we have seen is a renewable strategy, but what we've also seen is coal being exiled from America to Europe, thereby resulting in greenhouse gas emissions going up in Europe. So I think we do need to think about the convergence of markets and policy, which is actually the point you were making, Paul. How do you actually create the enabling framework that allows for the markets to work in a way that creates the best possible outcomes from the perspectives of security, sufficiency, and sustainability? Not or, and sustainability.
Well, if I may wrap and borrow another 5 seconds, Robin, I think in terms of the theme for the conference, what we've seen in this panel is that in addition to talking about the trust deficit, some of the challenges, we are now talking about the kind of coalitions that are needed in a way to deal with some of these governance challenges, which will not look like what we thought we knew before. And I think Stuart mentioned some of the vertical ones, Kayo mentioned some of the horizontal ones that we need to build across sectors. So I think as a theme, as a follow-up, one of the key themes here would be that indeed in the area of resources, security, economics and politics often go together. Winning the battle you can is not so simple to define, but nonetheless, there are new coalitions that are now being built at the national and global level. And last but not least, I'd like to apologize to Rob Bailey, who I sacrificed because of time today.